Last week on my channel, I tried to recreate a $2,000 designer dress using an old thrifted bedsheet. This week, I'm going to take you through every step and show you exactly how I made the dress. So go ahead and grab yourself a tea or a coffee and let's get started. Start off with ironing the fabric you're going to use to make it smooth and straight and easy to work with. Then we're going to find the patterns, and here I'm using the basic pattern from my pattern making video, and we're going to do some adjustments to make this pattern for this dress. But start by laying out all the pattern pieces on a piece of bed sheet or something that you can cut out and make a mock-up of. So I'm cutting out 2 side panels, 2 front panels, and 2 back panels, just as the pattern is cut out in my pattern making video. And I also cut out 1 sleeve, and the sleeve is made exactly how I show you in my pattern making video, just by adding length and some volume at the bottom. Start by sewing up the front seam of the front pattern and the side seam and attach the sleeve. And this is the mock-up that we're using to draw on the new marks to make the new pattern for this exact dress. I only left the side open so that I can close it up. And then I started drafting the raglan sleeve from the top of my neck all the way down to the armhole. And I also did the same thing on the back of the mock-up. Once the lines are drawn on, I'm going to cut from that mark and all the way down to the armhole, and then I'm going to start ripping apart the arms so that I get the seam allowance as well. Make sure that you don't rip it all the way because you want to cut that mark on the back side as well. Next, I opened the seam on the sleeve as well, and here I have a new sleeve pattern that I'm going to use when I'm cutting out the sleeve. But here I need to make sure that when I'm cutting out the sleeve on my dress, I'm going to cut it on the bias. So here I'm marking the bias onto the pattern so that I know and remember that I have to cut it out on the bias. I also seam rip all the pattern pieces so that I have 1 new front, 1 side panel, and 1 back. Then I start out cutting the sleeves on the bias, 2 pieces, and also 2 fronts and 2 side panels and 2 back panels. I also cut this out in a lining fabric as well. And next, for the skirt, I'm going to use the pattern made in another video where I show you how to make a half circle skirt. And this is a super easy pattern. You can go ahead and watch a lot of my other videos. I show you exactly how to make this. I added some extra length at the bottom. Next, I went ahead and I sewed up the front seam on the bodice, and then I added the side panels. After that, I sewed up the dart on the back panels, and then I sewed together the front with the 2 back panels in the side seams. Then I went ahead and I pressed open all the seams to make sure that they are flat and nice. Next, I went ahead and I did this exact same thing on the lining fabric. And I only line the bodice part, not the sleeve part. For the sleeve, I serged the edges and then I sewed up the sleeve together, right side facing each other, and I pressed the seam open. Next, I matched up the side seam on the bodice with the seam on the sleeves, and I pinned them together and I sewed them together along the raglan seam. Next, I overlapped the lining wrong side facing each other, and I serged the sleeve opening together. After serging the sleeve opening, I took the bodice part to the side for a bit, and we're going to continue on the skirt. For the skirt, start by sewing using a serger for the side seams, or you can use a zigzag stitch on your machine. Then sew up the front seam of the skirt using a straight stitch and press the seam open. Next, I also cut out a lining for the skirt, and I cut this out in one piece. Then I sew together the lining skirt with the lining bodice, and I only sewed the lining to the lining bodice. Then I went ahead and I sewed the skirt together with the outer fabric, and I made sure that the front seam matches. Next, I serged the sleeve bottom, and then I folded the edge about 1 centimeter and I sewed a straight stitch, leaving a little room to thread a elastic through. And I made sure that the elastic was wide enough to fit around my wrist. And then I tied a knot, and I hid the knot inside of the seam, and then I closed up the gap. Next, for the color, I'm going to use a color that I already had a pattern for, and I cut out this color in 2 pieces. So I had a back seam, so I didn't cut it out in one piece, but I cut it out so that I had to sew it together at the back. Then I curved the front of the color to make almost like a Chinese color. And this is something that I drafted myself, and I tried it on several times onto my dress to make sure that I got the look that I wanted, and tried to fit it around my neck. And also, you just need to do a lot of adjustment here. Make sure that you also cut the color out on the bias. Next, I also had to cut my neck a little lower on my dress. Then, when I was happy with the pattern for the Chinese collar, I made sure to cut it out in a interfacing as well. And I interfaced only one part of each collar. So I interfaced one part, and then the other part was not interfaced. Then I placed them right side facing each other, and I sewed a straight stitch along that collar and also along the back side. After that, I cut away any excess seam allowance to make sure that it was as close to the seam as possible. Then I flipped them right side facing out on both of the colors and make sure that every seam is pressed out nice and even. And then I checked everything if it was nice and if it was the way I wanted, and to do any adjustments, I could do that now. Press it flat and then line it right side facing the neckline of the dress and pin it along the neckline. After pinning it, I checked one last time to make sure that everything was nice and as I wanted it to look. And then I found some bias binding, and I decided to hide the raw seam with bias binding. So I opened the bias binding and I sewed it on first, right side facing the collar. After that, I sewed a support stitch. And lastly, I folded it over and I sewed it together with a hand stitch. And I just picked up some of the lining and some of the bias binding and sewed it along the neckline. Next, I attached an invisible zipper at the back. And I only sewed it to the outer fabric first on both sides. And then I closed up the seam at the back from the bottom of the zipper and all the way down to the bottom of the skirt. Once the zipper was installed on the outer fabric, I sewed up the lining as well. And I attached the lining using a hand stitch. For the bottom of the lining, I just used a serger and then I folded the hem 1 centimeter up and I did a stitch along the hem. For the outer skirt, I sewed on a bias binding at the bottom and then I folded it over and sewed a support stitch, and then lastly I folded it again and sewed a stitch. Now I'm going to cover a bunch of button, and here I have a button covering tool that I use to cover all my buttons, and I found this on eBay. It's such an amazing tool and I use it all the time. Next, I sewed on a bunch of buttons, and this is really what gives the dress such an exclusive look, and it just gives that final detail that you want for a designer-inspired dress. And you can add as many buttons that you want, and you can have them further apart if you don't want them to be too close. Now we're going to work on the belt, and for the belt I used a long strip of fabric that I interfaced on one side of the belt and I folded it in half. Next I sewed up the side seam, and the end seam should be curved. Then I cut away any excess fabric. Next, I used this long knitting tool and I put it inside of the belt to help me flip the belt around. After I flipped the belt around, I smoothed out any edges and I ironed the belt flat. For the belt buckle, I used some plastic lids and I drawed around my cup to make the round shape for the buckle. And then I cut out this shape. Next, I drew 2 half moons along the circle part to make that buckle in the middle of the circle. Then I had some material in my sewing stash, which is almost like thick foam. And this is something that I glued onto my plastic, and this makes it a bit sturdier. Once the glue was all dry, I used a final layer of hot glue from my hot glue gun and I glued it on all the way around the buckle. And this just gave it the final sturdiness that the belt buckle needed. And to cover it with fabric, I decided to just cut up some long strips of fabric and I folded them and tried to hide the raw edge. And then I just twisted it around the belt buckle just like a band-aid. And I did this all the way around the belt buckle, and it just gave it a very nice and almost a little bit rough finish, but I really like that result. And this was kind of my best try to make it myself because I don't have any belt buckle equipment. So this is me trying to do it myself at home. And it really worked. For the last part, I just used my scissor to try to put it inside of one of the folds to hide the raw edge. Once the raw edge was completely hidden inside of one fold, the belt buckle was finished and I could thread my belt inside and make sure that it fits. Then I just took it all the way down to the end and I folded the end 2 times. And then I sewed a seam to hide the raw edge inside and also to make sure that the belt buckle was secured. Once the belt buckle was secured, the dress was completely done. And here is the final reveal. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this tutorial and that you will give it a try. And please let me know in the comments down below what you want me to do next. If you want to see the challenge where I created this dress and all the behind the scenes and extra materials, you can click the video here and watch it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every Friday, and I will talk to you guys next Friday. Bye!